Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Charlene Margot, and I'm founder of the Parent Education Series, now a program of nonprofit, the Parent Venture. We are in our 18th year presenting this program and absolutely honored and delighted to have with us tonight author and journalist Virginia Sole-Smith, whose new book, Fat Talk, Parenting in the Age of Diet Culture, is a bestseller and really getting a lot of attention everywhere. So we are really just excited to have Virginia with us tonight to talk about her new book.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. I really appreciate it. Thank you for that lovely introduction. Yes, the houseplants keep multiplying. So we are going to get into this. I'm going to do the share screen thing, and we will, give me 1 second to get it loaded. Okay, here we are.
Perfect.
Good. It works yet again. So this is Fat Talk, an initiation. And the way I like to start with this is, even though we're on Zoom and I can't see all of your faces, I always ask for a show of hands, or just, answer this question to yourself. Who looks at this title and feels kind of immediately uncomfortable with the word fat? And to be clear, when I ask that, I see people are raising hands. I love it. A few years ago when I started working on this project, my hand would absolutely have been up too. So I want to be clear that if that's your starting point tonight, that's completely fine. That's where we all sort of start with this conversation. But so we're going to talk about why fat makes us so uncomfortable, and why it's so important to start to shift our understanding of this. And so let's start with a couple of definitions. The big overarching concept we're going to talk about tonight is anti-fat bias. Anti-fat bias is the oppression of people whose bodies do not conform to the thin ideal. Other terms you'll hear that mean pretty much the same thing are fatphobia, anti-fatness, and researchers tend to prefer the term weight stigma. So that's how you'll see it talked about in the literature. This is where, so often when we enter into this conversation, we're thinking about our personal relationship with our body. We're thinking about whether we love ourselves or we love how we look, that kind of thing. But anti-fat bias really is an institutional form of stigma. It shows up in workplaces. We have research showing that people in bigger bodies tend to earn less money, be promoted less readily than their thinner peers. It shows up in access to healthcare and how people are treated in doctors' offices, how seriously doctors take their pain, how quick they are to refer them for tests or specialist care, things like that. And unfortunately, the big one for parents is to understand that fat phobia shows up in our schools. Weight-based harassment is the most prevalent form of harassment reported by girls, and second most common for boys. And some studies have even found that teachers have lower expectations of students in larger bodies than they have of their thinner peers. And this includes expectations of their physical abilities. They've done studies on gym teachers showing that they expect that kids in bigger bodies will be less athletic and less coordinated. But I've even come across studies showing that this impacts their understanding of their intellectual abilities as well. One study found that kindergarten teachers were more likely to rate a child's math and reading skills as lower if they were in a bigger body compared to their thinner peers, regardless of what their test scores showed. So this is really pervasive. It's showing up in, beyond this, in who has access to clothing stores, who feels comfortable going into a restaurant and fitting into the seating, who feels comfortable sitting on an airplane. Anti-fat bias is baked into every part of our public world and how these spaces are created. So then diet culture is really sort of the way anti-fatness gets perpetrated in our culture. Diet culture is the system of beliefs that teaches us to idolize thinness, to equate body size with our health and our moral virtue, and we'll talk more about both of those as we go on. Diet culture also teaches us to constantly be seeking weight loss as a way of, promoting health, yes, but also attaining higher social status. This is where we learn how to categorize certain foods as good and healthy and other foods as bad and junk. Diet culture teaches us to connect exercise to body shape goals rather than thinking about exercising for stress reduction or exercising because it makes you feel good. And of course, all of this perpetuates fat phobia because it's all based on the idea that the thin body is better and more valuable than fatter bodies. Diet culture is really a tool of white supremacy and capitalism. It is designed to sell you on these ideals because that's what gets us all to buy products and spend money on weight loss drugs, books, all the different billion-dollar industry, all the different products that are sent our way. It really is not about health. And I know that can feel sort of jarring when we've all felt so attached to the idea that we want to be a healthy weight or that thinner is automatically healthier. But when we look back over history, and even this is just going back about 40 years, we can see how diet culture shows up again and again in how our culture interacts with food and bodies. And so this is just like a quick timeline going back to, when I was a kid in the 1980s, diet culture was all about low calorie and low fat. So this was the Snackwells era. And this was also a time when I think, for kids, there was probably in some ways less pressure. I remember eating Happy Meals at McDonald's as a kid, and I don't think my parents felt the kind of shame and stigma that parents today feel about serving their kids fast food. But the grownups all around me were eating low fat everything and low calorie everything. So there were a lot of mixed messages. As we get into the 90s, you see the rise of whole grains, of farmers markets, bringing things like mesclun greens across the country, the sun-dried tomato. This was great for increasing, the range of foods that were available, but it also led to more intensified ideas about what healthy eating should look like. And healthy eating started to become a lot more expensive and a lot more about having these higher end kind of really sought after trendy foods as opposed to just, eating the food groups the way you might have learned in the past. And then as we get into the 2000s, you see the rise of the farmers markets, the focus on eating local and eating seasonally, which of course has really powerful environmental implications. But in order to sell that message, lots of folks in the organic and alternative food movements really started to talk about the obesity epidemic and about eating this way as a way to achieve thinness. And so if you think about the work of someone like Michael Pollan, who I think a lot of us really admired at the time and certainly has contributed importantly to conversations about eating, he very quickly took the conversation about what's good for farmers or what's good for the environment and made it about the pursuit of thinness, because it's hard to get Americans to care about the plight of organic farm workers, but it's not hard to get us to care about our gene size. And so it was a really efficient way to mainstream that conversation. And as we've gotten, as we go further along into the 2010s and, in the last 20 years, I call this the kale smoothie era of diet culture, where it's kind of like all those messages of the past decades, we never shed them. I think people who really subscribed to low fat and low calorie in the 80s still in their hearts feel like that's the right way to eat, but they've added on the anxiety about carbohydrates or the anxiety about sugar, processed foods. Every new iteration of, quote, healthy eating as marketed through diet culture only serves to make eating feel more and more complicated for people. And again, even more and more about the pursuit of thinness more than the pursuit of health or well-being. And then the other big shift that's happened in diet culture that, again, I think is really important for parents to be thinking about is how much diet culture now shows up in kid food culture. I really love this slide this is an Instagram post from the account Feeding Littles, comparing a lunch that we might have packed for ourselves in the 1990s, a turkey sandwich, an apple, chips, and a cookie, and not thought twice about, compared to the kind of lunches that a lot of parents feel like we need to produce for our kids today. And you see the bento box with, I think, 5 different types of produce, hummus, the veggie sushi rolls. And so it's, more expensive to eat this way compared to the 90s lunch for sure. It's more difficult, more ingredients for parents to have to manage and prepare ahead of time. And it's also really out of step with the way a lot of kids eat, right? So parents end up feeling like failures that their kid doesn't want to eat the rainbow in this way and would rather eat the bag of chips without understanding what's perhaps developmentally appropriate for kids in terms of where they are as developing eaters. So this is not to say that, we all benefit from eating more produce, but these unrealistic expectations that a child would eat this many different types of produce in one meal, and that if they don't, you're somehow getting lunch wrong. Those are the expectations that we see that really, again, are not about health. They're about diet culture and about performative parenting. And then the last term I want to define for you before we get really into the meat of things is thin privilege. So, thin privilege is like white privilege in that it is often invisible to folks who have it. And to be clear, everyone struggles with feeling like their body is good enough in diet culture. Everyone feels like their body could be smaller, look different, because our beauty and diet standards are so rigid in this culture. But the more thin privilege you have, the less you struggle to fit your body into the world because the world is built for your body. So if you can fit into airplane seats, if you can walk into a clothing store and be pretty confident they're going to have your size in stock for most items, you benefit from thin privilege. And recognizing that we have, to what degree we all have this privilege is a really important first step towards understanding anti-fatness as a systemic form of oppression. So it's really not about, this is a quote from Aubrey Gordon, one of my colleagues who, I admire tremendously. And when we talked about this, she said, like someone with more thin privilege than me might not have to worry about strangers shouting, "Hey, fatso," at them. They might not have to worry about whether a doctor will agree to treat them or what will happen if they get on an airplane. This is really about how other people treat you and about how your body feels in public spaces, not how you feel about your own body. And so, I identify as a fat person, but on the smaller end of the fat spectrum. And so I benefit from thin privilege because I can shop in some clothing stores, I can fit on airplane seats, and I have that privilege relative to someone bigger than me who has more trouble accessing public spaces. And it's just really important to be cognizant of this and to think about how could we all be working to make public spaces and to make the world in general, any space we have any control over, more inclusive and welcoming of all bodies. So as I've been defining all of these terms, I'm guessing that a lot of questions are coming up because this is a topic that brings up a ton of questions for folks. One really big question that you might be thinking about right now is, okay, sure, Virginia, I get it. We should be nicer to fat people, but aren't we actually fatter now? Isn't there an obesity crisis going on? And if so, what are we supposed to be doing about that? So yes, we Americans on average are bigger today than we were a generation ago. These are some statistics from the CDC breaking down where you can see from 1976 to 1980, 15% of adults had a body mass index in the obese range compared to 41.9% in the most recent survey. And the numbers have similarly climbed for kids. So yes, we're not denying that there's been a change in this data, although it is worth understanding that the way the data has been collected over the years has changed. And in particular, there was a major recalibration of the body mass index in 1998, where the National Institutes of Health lowered the cutoff points for the overweight and obese categories. And so literally overnight in June 1998, 29 million Americans without gaining a pound were moved from the normal and overweight categories up into the overweight and obese categories. So some of the huge spike we see in these numbers is explained by just how they've been choosing to collect the data over the years and changing those instruments. But it's also true, even if we control for that, we see some changes in the numbers. And it's important to think about why. So here's what you hear most often. This is what we think we know about the obesity epidemic. We know that our food supply has changed, that Americans cook less than they did a generation ago. We eat out more, we eat more fast food, we eat more processed foods. We also hear a lot about how we're much more sedentary. We're on screens all the time now. We're not as active as we were a generation ago. Kids aren't riding their bikes around neighborhoods the way they used to. This often very quickly turns into people blaming single moms or moms in general or bad, lazy parenting. And as the sort of big thing that changed, women entered the workforce and suddenly our kids became less healthy. I think it's really important to be skeptical about that, to be honest. I think you can very quickly see the level of bias at play there. But I'm not going to argue that, yeah, these things have changed. There have been some changes in the food supply and activity levels and screen time, and all of these may contribute to body size shifting over the generations. But there is a bigger answer that nobody really wants to talk about. So, I got a little bit ahead of myself here. The 1998 cutoff changing of the data is a really big piece of this. There was a similar change in 2010 where researchers changed how the cutoff points for children's weight were classified, which again, sort of shifts how these numbers look. But the really big change is the fact that for 40 years, our public health system has been focusing on weight loss. And what we know about pursuing weight loss is that over time, whatever sort of weight loss you're pursuing, whether it's a calorie restriction, dieting, exercise, weight loss drugs, bariatric surgery, etc., we see that people lose weight in the short term and ultimately regain that weight in the next 2 to 5 years after whatever initial weight loss. So as a country, we've basically been yo-yo dieting for 40 years. It's not surprising we've ended up bigger because the intense pressure that has been created around from the diet industry, from the public health communities, our own government's messaging around this has been teaching us for 40 years to feel guilty when we eat certain foods, to feel like our bodies aren't good enough, to feel like we should always be trying to lose 10 pounds and then another 10 pounds and then another 10 pounds. And I think that's really taken a toll. So let's talk about how this is really showing up for our kids. We see from research that as early as ages 3 to 5, kids learn to associate fat with bad. Nearly half of preschool girls worry about being fat. And we saw in the start of this century an absolutely meteoric rise for hospitalizations for eating disorders for kids under 12. Some of that is because we didn't previously even think kids under 12 got eating disorders, and then doctors realized they did and started treating them. But there's also clearly been this shift where, and I see this as a parent of kids in elementary school now, there is more awareness. My own 6-year-old came home from school the other day and said to me, so-and-so said I'm fat and I think I need to lose weight. And I was like, well, good thing you have me as a mom and we're going to get into it. But kids talk about this because they hear parents talk about this, they hear teachers talk about this, and they're just trying it on, and they're using these terms often without being really aware of how much, how loaded it is to have this conversation. But it's definitely something they're exploring even at these really early ages. And then by the time we get into high school and middle school, the numbers really start to get scary. So 28% of kids aged 8 to 15 start a diet. Between the ages of 13 and 16, that goes up to almost 40% of kids that try dieting. The median age onset for eating disorders is 12.6. Around 1 million teenagers in the United States will develop an eating disorder before age 21. This is a really big number of kids. And we often have this misconception that eating disorders only happen to, in particular, thin white girls. That's the image a lot of us have of who gets eating disorders. But the research is increasingly showing that eating disorders happen in all genders. They happen to, people of all ages, and all racial backgrounds, and all body sizes. And for kids in bigger bodies especially, they tend to be sicker by the time they actually get treatment, because when a kid in a bigger body size shows up at the doctor having lost weight, they're probably going to be congratulated for it and told to keep going, and maybe told to double down and even do more than what you're doing. So the very same behaviors and changes in body size that might raise a red flag in a thin kid as a red flag for an eating disorder will get praised and even prescribed by healthcare providers for fat kids. So this is a really, deeply concerning facet of all of this, that they're starting to not only experiment with dieting, but that for some subset of kids, and I want to be clear, eating disorders are a really multifaceted mental health condition. There's a genetic component, there's environmental components, but the exposure to diet culture And more specifically, childhood experiences with weight-based shaming and teasing and childhood dieting are the top predictors for who develops eating disorders. So, there's a pretty clear through line here. So then, I think it's important to really drill into, okay, what harm have we just gone over here? How does diet culture harm fat folks? We've talked about the chronic experiences of bullying, microaggressions and stigma, less access to healthcare. Fat folks tend to receive lower quality healthcare when they are getting treated. We've talked about workplace disparities, access to clothing, public spaces, and the increased risk for eating disorders. For kids in bigger bodies especially, they often grow up encountering parents and caregivers who are bringing this diet mentality to everything they eat. And because all kids are getting this message over and over that their body is their value, what kids in bigger bodies are learning is that they basically have no value because their body doesn't measure up to what the adults around them want to see. But I also think it's important to talk about how diet culture harms thin folks, because it really is a universal cause of harm. And I often otherwise find that parents of straight-sized kids, thin kids, may start to tune out a little bit and think like, okay, well, I have to raise my kid to be nice to the fat kid, but this isn't really an issue for us. Unfortunately, thin kids are also really damaged by diet culture. Thin kids may experience skinny shaming, comments like, you just need to eat a sandwich, or I hate you because you're so thin. That stuff is really harmful and damaging to the thin kid. It's arguably even more harmful and damaging to any kids in bigger bodies standing nearby who hear those comments, because skinny shaming is always rooted in anti-fat bias. But kids in smaller bodies may also get a lot of positive attention for their bodies. This was definitely my experience as a thin child, and I've seen it with my straight-sized kids. You have ballerina legs, you have a dancer's body, you have a gymnast's body, you have a runner's body. Kids start to learn that their body size is something to be proud of, that it's a part of their identity, and that this is, again, their value. And that doesn't allow for their bodies to change, which is a really big problem because bodies change. It's what all bodies do, whether you start out thin and end up fat, or you stay pretty much thin most of the time, but shape changes, clothes fit differently. I mean, we're all changing all the time. We're aging and growing, and that's what our bodies are supposed to do. And that's especially what kids' bodies are supposed to do. And so when thin kids get these messages, they're very likely to feel like I have to hang on to my thinness at all costs. And then that sets them up for, again, increased risk of dieting and eating disorders. So I think it's pretty clear to say that the war on obesity has failed. I mean, this is a war we've been fighting for 40 years, but as the statistics show, we didn't get thinner as a result, we got bigger. So it has failed at that sort of very basic level of they were trying to make people thinner and nobody got thinner. But it has also failed our kids, because we see over and over that the strongest predictors of weight gain for kids are these experiences of weight teasing and dieting, just like these are the strongest predictors for eating disorders. And so and just to drill into that statistic a little more, the research shows that kids who diet at a really severe level are 18 times more likely to develop an eating disorder. But even moderate dieters who may be following a plan prescribed by a doctor or encouraged by a parent, something that seems really reasonable and not super restrictive, 5 times more likely to develop an eating disorder. So the risk is really significant. And I appreciate this quote from Kenesha Campbell, who's a doctor at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, who specializes in medical management of eating disorders and sees kids in all body types struggling in this way. And what she said to me is, I'm not saying extreme obesity isn't a problem, but malnutrition will kill you quicker. Restrictive eating disorders kill more kids than diabetes and cancer. I think as we have started to, as we have in this effort to combat this quote epidemic, which again, the data is not entirely clear on, we have really fueled a secondary epidemic of eating disorders and disordered eating and body dissatisfaction. So what can we do about this? Now we're going to get into some strategies for naming, navigating, and dismantling anti-fatness and diet culture in workplaces, in schools. And I think there's a lot in here that you can take into your own homes as well. The number one shift that's so important to make and does take a little bit of practice is to shift our language around bodies. You did hear me use the words obesity and overweight when I was referring to research in that first half of the presentation. But in general, removing what we call the O words from your vocabulary is a really great step towards fat positivity and allyship, because we have lots of studies showing that for fat folks, these words are stigmatizing. They have been pathologized and weaponized against us. They've been used as slurs. And when you actually look at the Latin origins of the word obesity, it comes from a Latin word that means to eat oneself fat. So a stereotype about fat people is embedded in what became a medical diagnosis, which kind of really sums up the whole problem. In an attempt to improve people's health, we accepted pathologizing people for how they look, which is just never a helpful starting place for improving any of this. What myself and a lot of other fat activists are pushing for is actually reclaiming the word fat, that word that made so many of us uncomfortable at the start of this talk, and thinking of it as just another way to have a body. So just like you might say someone is tall or short, you can say they're fat or thin, and you're not attributing any moral value to that. You're simply describing them. I would go one step further and say that it's, to whatever extent we can get there, reclaiming fat as a positive descriptor is also a really joyful way to help kids understand that all bodies are good bodies. If we're saying to them all bodies are good bodies, but we're struggling to say the word fat, we're not really, delivering on that promise to them. And so making it, yeah, you have a fat body, fat bodies are great. I know that sounds sort of wild and it does take practice, but I've seen it pay really amazing dividends. That said, if you yourself are thin and you're talking to a fat person, you should, number one, ask them, number one, don't describe people's bodies without their permission. That's a great etiquette rule for all of us. If for some reason you do have to describe someone's body, ask, which I do as a journalist all the time, ask people how they identify and how they want to talk about their bodies and use their terms. So, that's the most respectful way to go about it. If you're talking more generally about people and you're worried that the word fat may not land with everyone in your audience, that, that this is a loaded term, for a straight size person to use this term can be uncomfortable, then sticking with more body neutral terms like higher weight or larger body is a better way to go. But you will hear some folks in the weight research community arguing for person first language, like person with obesity. I can tell you as a person with obesity, that does not work for me at all. It does not make me feel seen. It does make me feel labeled and stigmatized and like I'm not going to be taken seriously. So I'd rather just go with that and, call a spade a spade. And this is an old tweet of mine that I throw in here because this is a moment I had with my younger daughter that shows the power of reclaiming fat as a positive term. So we were reading books one night at bedtime and she said to me, "Your tummy is fat because you grew me inside it." And I was like, "Well, yeah, you definitely helped, but I think my tummy was always going to be fat." And she said to me, "Yes, some tummies just get to grow up to be fat." And it was such a powerful moment for me. I think for her, it was just a thing she said and she moved right on. But the idea that a kid would have not only no negative connotations with a fat tummy, but because it belongs to her mom and she loves her, that she would think of it as like, oh, maybe I'll get to grow up to be like that, is a pretty powerful thing. So the next thing I want us to think about is any public space you have jurisdiction over or involvement with, how size inclusive is it? If you're in a classroom or an office setting, what are the widths and the weight limits on the chairs and desks? Often I hear a lot from especially teenagers in bigger bodies about the hell that is classroom seating where the desk is attached to the chair because they may not be able to put the desk all the way down and fit their body in the chair. And what a mortifying experience for a kid to have to go to school every day and know they're going to fight to fit into their desk. Um, but think about this too in your own dining room at home. If how sturdy are your chairs? How comfortable are they for bigger bodies? How welcoming are you being to all body types? And this is a great thing to talk about with kids too. If you're replacing a dining room chair, like say, yeah, I'm looking to check what the weight limit is to make sure that this will work for anyone who comes over to our house. It's really important to surround kids with art and books that celebrate body diversity of all kinds. There's a long list of resources on Burnt Toast, my newsletter, of books for all different ages. And it's also in the back of Fat Talk as well. Actually, there's a long resource list. Um, you know, Fiction, nonfiction, picture books, etc. And I look both for books that talk about this very directly, the importance of embracing body size and body size diversity. But I also look for books that have a fat protagonist where that's not the central plot point, right? Because fat kids are just as complicated and multi-layered as anyone else. And we want kids to be able to see themselves represented in media and not have the story always be about their weight, but also just have them be characters living lives and having adventures and doing all those things. So you can definitely get more ideas for that from the book and from my website. And then, thinking about uniforms. This is a big thing. We often hear when thinking back to that like reason for the obesity epidemic, the lack of activity. And we know that rates of youth sport participation have really gone down in recent decades. Well, maybe one reason kids are not playing sports is because the uniforms aren't fitting. And so thinking about how to make sure that everyone isn't just like, great, you can be on the team and you're mostly going to be on the bench and we don't have a jersey for you, but like how are coaches thinking about how to really include kids in all bodies, pay attention to kids in all bodies, not just to the kid who has the quote right body for that sport. And just any other specialized gear. I mean, another story in the book is of a kid wanting to go to a laser tag birthday party and realizing the vest at the laser tag place won't fit them. And so they don't go to the birthday party. And this leads to a lot of isolation. So yeah, just a little bit more. Oh, and here's the link. If I move my head, there's a link there for fat positive media. The other thing I'll say about this is this doesn't mean you have to ban media with fat stereotypes, because if you did that, you would never read a book or watch a TV show again, pretty much, because this is so pervasive. But I do encourage parents and teachers to think about when those moments crop up, how can I use that to have a jumping off point, have a conversation with my kids? And there's just so many examples. Harry Potter is full of fat stereotypes about Dudley Dursley going on a diet and the way Harry makes fun of him for his weight. And it was really interesting reading those books. J.K. Rowling is super complicated for so many reasons now, but reading them a few years ago with my daughter, and having her look up, at the start of book 3 and saying to me, "Oh, Mom, you're going to hate this. They've got Dudley on a diet." And I thought, like, okay, she is developing the skills she needs to start identifying the bias and identifying the stereotypes. And that's really valuable. So you don't need to shy away from them being exposed to the other thing, but you do want to keep talking about what you're seeing. And if you have a kid in a bigger body, be sensitive to like, how does that make you feel? And, if you don't want to read this book because of that, I totally get it. And you don't have to. And just giving them the space to process that with you. It's also really important, and this is honestly a bigger conversation than we have time for in the scope of this presentation, but there's a lot more about this in the first few chapters of Fat Talk. So if my, really quick going through this now leaves you with a lot of questions, it's all in the book. But we need to separate weight and health. We have been taught over and over that thin equals healthy and fat equals unhealthy. The research just does not support this. Most of the research showing poor health outcomes in higher body weights are showing correlations, not causations. We know that people's lifestyle habits matter more, that social determinants of health, like their socioeconomic status, other experiences of oppression, access to healthcare, access to healthy food, all of that matters more than your weight. And there are actually a lot of times where higher body weight can be protective, which is really interesting. Folks in bigger bodies tend to have better recoveries after open heart surgery, lower rates of osteoporosis, better responses to cancer treatment. We don't talk about all of that because it doesn't sort of jive with the larger narrative that we hear about weight and health. But it just shows that this is a much more nuanced picture than what we've been led to understand. And we also know that the experience of living with weight stigma causes significant harm to our mental and physical health. So it's very possible that a lot of the poor health outcomes we can tie to higher body weight are actually more of a result of how people are treated for living in those bodies than the weight itself. So again, there's a lot more to this, a lot of nuance to it. But as we're talking about health with kids, I think the number one thing we can do is just leave weight out of most health related conversations. It doesn't really need to be there. You can talk about health without talking about weight, without talking about weight loss, and that can go a long way. And then thinking about how to normalize eating and normalize eating for joy. This is a quote from Lisa Dubril, who's a fantastic eating disorder therapist and fat activist that I've interviewed over the years. And she talks about, we experience, as we're getting ready for Thanksgiving next week, I'm sure you've all experienced that narrative of people sitting around the table. I can't believe I ate so much. The diet starts Monday. How many calories was in this, et cetera, et cetera. And we're completely missing the point, right? Because sharing a meal is how we bond. It's how we connect with other humans. It's something we're like wired to seek out and crave. So it doesn't make you a food addict to do that. It doesn't mean you have no willpower. It doesn't mean anything about you as a person or your moral value. It means you're doing what humans do, which is sharing community around food and looking for ways to drop the negative the negative ways we talk about food and recognizing that so much of that is rooted in anti-fatness. That's a really important step. And then another thing for kids is, especially as we get into the tween and teen years, they'll start using things like I feel fat and helping kids understand like that's not a feeling. Fat is a body type. It's not a bad body type. So when you say that, you're masking what your real emotions are because we're all taught to blame our bodies first. And I think another important step here is to recognize that when someone's body changes, don't assume that if it's weight loss, it's proof of health, happiness, and healing, even if they were fat to begin with. And if they gain weight, it's not always proof that things are going wrong. And so just like separating out the idea that someone's body size can tell you about their emotional health or that someone's emotional health should be determined by how they feel about their body. And then we've really hit on this, but just understanding how important it is to frame anti-fatness as a social justice issue. So as much as we want kids to love their bodies and have strong body image, which of course we do, we need to also understand that we're talking about systemic oppression. And so just like when white parents don't talk enough about racism, white kids are more likely to develop racist beliefs. When we don't talk to our kids about what anti-fat bias is, we are more likely to raise kids who believe all of the negative stereotypes about fat bodies. And that is harmful to them and it allows them to cause harm to other people. So, just to end on a script I like to use in explaining what this is to kids, you can say something like, a lot of people think and say mean things about fat people. This is called fatphobia. It's a really big problem in our world, but grownups like me are trying to fix it, and you can help us. Thank you so much. I think Charlene is going to come back and we've got time to do some of your questions.
Thank you so much, Virginia, for that really, really thoughtful discussion. I think you've given us all so much to think about. And, parents, I've been in education for 35 years. I get a lot of parenting books. Secret, I don't read them all. I read this book and I loved it. No matter what size you are, what size your child is, there's something for everyone because we all have people of different sizes in our lives. And it's good for us all to get educated. So speaking, Virginia, of your question about social justice, I was so struck by that story about the laser tag vest. Could you just give us
Yes.
those two options that you write about of things parents can say?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, this could be a laser tag vest or anytime maybe you're planning your kid's birthday party. And you want to say to them, like, will all your friends be able to participate in this? If you're going to an amusement park, are they going to fit on the rides? Like, anything like that. And if that's not the case, a risk would be that you might say to your kid, like, oh, well, we can't go there because Theo can't wear the laser tag vest. And then that kind of paints Theo as a victim to be pitied. But if instead you said to your kid, you know what if we went to the zoo instead? Because you and Theo both love seeing the reptiles. And why don't we do a reptile birthday party? And so you're helping your child understand that, like, their friend who's in a bigger body, like, isn't someone to be pitied. It isn't it isn't like a reason not to be friends with them. Or it's saying, like, the reason we're not going to do laser tag is because the laser tag people aren't caring enough about Theo. And we do, and we want to spend time with this great kid. So you're putting the blame where it belongs, on the system, not on the child. And you're helping your child understand, really what it means to be a good friend and a good ally.
Yeah, I just think that as a developmental educator, that really touched my heart, Virginia. It's such an important distinction. Take the burden, take the onus off the child, put it back on the system. And kids get that. Kids
Yeah,
get,
absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
they really do.
So, in reading your book, there's so many times I wish that I'd had this book for conversations with my own kids. They're now young adults. One is raising a 20-month-old. What is the one thing you really want parents to take away from Fat Talk? You have so many messages. That may be a tough thing, but
That's a tough thing.
I just
Um,
really, there's so many things that you taught me that I wish I had known.
I think the biggest one is that your goal is to raise a kid who trusts their body, regardless of their body size, and who feels like their body is valuable, regardless of their body size. And so, if you use that as your lens, you start to see very quickly when body size bias is sort of clouding that mission. Is it worth dying on the mountain of you need to eat this broccoli in order to have dessert? Or is it worth giving your child the body autonomy to decide for themselves how much broccoli to eat? Because one achieves the short-term goal of getting your kid to eat some broccoli tonight, but they don't end up loving broccoli because you've, pushed them to eat it. But the other says, like, big picture, I want you to trust yourself and listen to your body and not do something that doesn't feel good in your body. And if we need to practice that by you rejecting broccoli at my dinner table, that seems like a really useful life skill.
Yeah, and there's just so many ways that parents, well-meaning or not, do things that are not helpful. Like you write about the parent who had the candy locked up in a safe or
Right.
the
Right.
pantry. It's kind of like back in the day when the parents would say to me, "Oh, we don't let our kids watch TV." And I'm like, "Well, they're watching down the street."
Exactly. We need to be realistic about, and with treat foods in particular, as a parent, I can always tell which kid my kids are friends with who has a lot of rules around treats at their house, because when they come to my house, it's like, they can't get enough of them because they're so restricted normally. And it's easy as a parent to be really alarmed by that and to sort of demonize the child, like, oh my God, they have no control around cookies, instead of recognizing anti-fatness has caused this family to be really anxious about treats, and this child has learned that these things are forbidden and that they don't get a lot of access to them. And now that they have access to them, they're very understandably having as much as they can because they don't know when it's coming back. And so understanding how we sometimes create these patterns and these behaviors because of our own fear, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way.
Absolutely. So here's a related and very good question. Writer asks, if body size shape isn't part of our family's regular conversation, how much should it be proactively brought up?
Yeah, I love that question. I think it should be proactively brought up. I'm almost curious to have you think a little more about why it's not part of your conversation. Like, is it that you're all straight sized and you don't have a lot of people in bigger bodies in your life? I would say you need to work on building some fat community. But like, you should have fat friends. Is it that everyone's really uncomfortable around weight? And so it's like getting brushed under the rug all the time and no one wants to talk about it. That's something to look at as well. So first think about why you're not talking more about it. But then, some easy places to start are with picture books, books that show bigger bodies. And there's so many wonderful ones. There's Big by Vashti Harrison that just came out. Bodies Are Cool by Tyler Fetter is an incredible one. So depending on the age of your kids, like looking for books with fat protagonists or fat characters so you can talk about it. Following fat creators on social media, so using social media for good. If you really love Lizzo, if you really love any other fat artists that you can talk about, and then looking for reasons to say like, yeah, I love that she's so proud of her body. That's amazing. And just looking for casual ways to bring it in. It doesn't need to be like a sit down, we're going to have the fat talk right now. The fat talk is so many talks, and you can just keep having them.
Yeah. And again, I want to say, everybody, this book is incredibly well researched and your resources are fantastic. She has reading, as she said, for children of every age, along for parents and professionals. So a lot of good questions coming in, everybody. Keep them coming. This one I love. What's your advice for the situation where the adult wants to and works to lose weight, but doesn't want to impart the wrong message to their kids about weight?
Yeah, this is a really tricky one, and it's very, very common. One, have some grace for yourself. It's completely logical that you are trying to pursue weight loss in a culture that tells you how important that is, that, you may have doctors telling you it's medically necessary. It may just not feel safe to be in a bigger body because it often isn't. So like have some like compassion for that and don't beat yourself up for being there. That said, it isn't healthy for kids to be exposed to dieting really in any form. And so as much as you're able to, continue to share meals with your children, continue to eat the foods that they love eating, like find ways to still share, Christmas cookies or whatever favorite foods you guys have, popcorn on movie nights with them. So they're not seeing you eating really differently. If they ask questions about what you're doing, I think you can, if it's something that a doctor's advised you to do, you can say it's something I'm doing for my health. I don't want you to worry about this. Your body is great the way it is. We're not worried about your body size. There's a lot here though. I mean, it is very difficult fundamentally to model body acceptance and also be trying to change your own body. So just, be aware that there is that disconnect and they may ask you some hard questions. But as long as you are continuing to be a good ally in other ways, like continue to name anti-fat bias when you see it in TV shows or books, continue to look for ways to be supportive to fat folks in your community. We don't have to be like all doing this all perfectly all the time. Like that's a diet culture mentality. So you are allowed to make your own choices for your body and still say this bias is harmful. And I'm going to talk to my kids about how we combat it.
And, then the kids can help. I remember, like many women, most women, not always being very kind to myself about my body. There were parts I wanted to change. And my teenage daughter said to me, "You're not very nice to yourself, Mom." And I thought, right.
Yeah. And sometimes that's really helpful. I mean, one of the most powerful moments for me on letting go a lot of this was when my daughter was just 2 and I said something critical about my body and she repeated it back to me. And I suddenly thought like, oh, well, that's how I pass it all on is, if she can't hear it from me. So making sure to like really never body shame yourself and, don't talk negatively about anybody's bodies, but kids do really pay attention to how we talk about our own bodies.
They really do. They really do. And they're smart. So here's a good question about school breakfast, school food. Writer says, if the National School Breakfast Program breakfast may include a bowl of Fruit Loops and a glass of orange juice, 41 grams of sugar, don't we need to do something about the food in schools? How can we not talk about kids' food? I think we do talk. I mean, I'm part of the Wellness Advisory Council in our school district. We do talk about food, but what's your input on that, Virginia?
Yeah, so across the board, school lunches and school breakfast have become The nutrition standards have been raised and the nutritional quality of school meals has increased tremendously. I am not seeing that Fruit Loops breakfast in my own kids' school. There was a really interesting study that came out that I have footnoted in the book, that found that the nutritional quality of school lunches is actually one of the healthier places people are eating in America right now when they compared it to restaurants. So by and large, there have been big improvements. I do frequently hear from parents in different districts saying that is not what's happening in my district. So we can absolutely advocate for higher nutritional standards in kids' meals and not talk to kids negatively about food. It would not be productive to say to a child, there's Fruit Loops in your cafeteria, don't eat them. Because number one, maybe that's the only food some kids feel safe eating in their cafeteria. Maybe you have someone with a really, significant cautious eating history or feeding disorder history, and Fruit Loops is one of their safe foods. Well, then Fruit Loops is a really nutritious option for that kid, because otherwise they're not going to eat at all. And we know that not eating breakfast is way less healthy than eating Fruit Loops. So I think it's important for us to consider, like, what roles are these processed foods playing in the school meals? And for some kids, they may be providing really important nutritional value, even if they have high levels of sugar that don't meet our sort of larger, what we consider quote unquote gold standards nutrition. And you don't want kids to feel like they can't trust the food in their cafeteria. So that's really not a conversation to have with kids. That's a conversation to have with your district. I'm also on the wellness committee at my kids' school, where we look at these questions and think like, are we providing a good range of options? Are we meeting the needs of neurodiverse kids with different dietary issues? Like, it goes way beyond just sugar content in terms of providing healthy school meals.
So let's turn to the kids for a minute. Here is little girl who says, hi, I'm in the 4th grade and I get bullied every day because I'm fat.
Oh, heartbreaking. I'm so sorry that you're experiencing that. I think the most important thing to know is that your body is fantastic. It does not need to change. Kids are using this language because kids have learned that these are the kinds of words that are going to be hurtful to people. And helping kids understand that, you can be proud of your body the way it is. You don't need to change for anybody. And you deserve support from all the grownups in your life to help stop this bullying. And that this is not okay. This is harassment. This is weight-based teasing. There should be an adult who is talking to the school, who is, monitoring the situation so that kids cannot continue to treat a child in this way. So we have to simultaneously, when kids experience this, I think we often want to rush in and say things like, oh, but you're perfect the way you are, which I mean, I kind of just did because it's true. But we can't do that without also validating, like, this is really hurtful and wrong that you're experiencing this, and it is absolutely not your fault, and we're going to help make it better. So we validate the harm that they've experienced without saying anything, like making it clear that the bullies are in the wrong. It is not this child's body that's in the wrong.
So she needs some help from the adults in her life.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. The adults in her life need to have conversations and figure out what they can put in place to protect her.
Okay. Thank you, Virginia.
Yeah.
Here's another good question. How do you help your teen who feels terrible about their body and asks for your help to be thin?
I think it's important not to rush in with negating this again. Like, it's understandable that kids have these concerns, right? This is the message they've been getting. But I think I would say, like, what's making you feel like thinness is really important right now? What else is going on here? Tell me more about why it feels important to pursue thinness, and let them really get out, is it bullying at school? Is it stuff going on with friends? Is it messaging they're getting online? Like, really talk through like all of the stuff that they're hearing about this and sit with how hard that is. And then I think as a parent, we can say, I'm not going to help you pursue thinness because I know how dangerous that is to your health. I know the risks of dieting, and that is a line we're going to draw. But let's figure out what support you need to feel better where you are now. And then also with tweens and teenagers, I think starting to help them understand this as systemic oppression is really powerful, because then they can start to recognize it's not just me, it's not me doing something wrong. This is a larger system, that there's someone else I can put the blame on, put the blame where it belongs again, and help these kids understand that this is something they can call out as a problem. I often find that then kids are able to start becoming advocates for themselves and for others in a way that's really empowering, and can start to shift away from feeling like this is so important to pursue. But also, just keep tabs on, if you notice skipping meals, if you notice they always have a stomach ache and don't want to eat dinner, like definitely keep tabs on changes in eating, because of course you just saying, I'm not going to let you diet is not going to prevent a child from experimenting with this. So you want to keep tabs on what's happening, but giving them some, more resources. And again, there's a lot of materials so that they can start to learn about these issues and understand the role they can play.
I mean, I'm very concerned about the fact that they've come out now advising some of these drugs like Wegovy for kids. My guess is there's going to be a lot of kids clamoring for those drugs.
Yeah, it is really concerning, because we don't have a lot of long-term data on the impact of those types of drugs on kids during puberty. They're, going through rapid periods of growth and body changes. I'm definitely concerned about the long-term health impact about that. But I think too, it's tricky because it means that kids are getting this, it's the adults are reinforcing what the bullies are telling them. That's the whole problem here, is that they're going to hear this stuff at school, and then they're going to go to a doctor's office, and the doctor's going to say, great, I have a drug for you. And I know the doctors are well-intentioned. I know they are trying to put kids' health first, but I don't see how we can prescribe intentional weight loss to kids and tell them that their bodies are not the problem. Like, these two messages just conflict. And so I am really concerned. And I'm concerned too about, I think we're going to see them disproportionately prescribed for, more marginalized kids, parents who don't feel like they can advocate as much in the doctor's office. So it's super concerning to see how that plays out.
Thank you, Virginia. And, we have come to the end of our hour, but there's one question I just have to ask because it's from another child. What would you advise a fifth grade girl to say in response to another student calling them fat?
This is really, really tough, and I'm glad you're asking this. I think, understanding that fat is a great way to have a body. So this is not an insult. And, for you to know that and kind of hold on to it when it happens, maybe that will enable you to say something like, okay, great. Nothing wrong with being fat, and just like kind of taking the air out of their sail, the wind out of their sails a little bit, by letting them know that this doesn't hurt you. That is not a word that can really be used to hurt you. I know it is being used to hurt you. And again, I don't want to dismiss how hurtful that is when a word gets weaponized against us, but understanding that you can be proud of your body. You can feel good about who you are and how you're showing up in the world. You do not need to change. And so just letting them know, like, yeah, okay, so I'm fat, that's the fact about my body. Other people have bigger problems. Like, and, just let them know that it's not okay. And again, don't be afraid to enlist the help of some adults to back you up on this, because it's not okay for kids to be bullying each other about body size ever.
Exactly. Well, listen, thank you so much, Virginia Soul-Smith. I have 25 more questions I would love to ask you. We could do hours and hours, but this is such a thoughtful book. And again, it's for everybody. It's for everybody that cares about kids, who has a kid, who loves kids. So I recommend it highly. And Virginia, thank you for all your words of wisdom tonight. You've given us lots to think about. I wish I could ask more of these questions, but it has been a pleasure having you here with us tonight. So big thank you.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. Thank you to everyone for the great questions.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. This video will be available soon. I know that you will want to watch it and share it. Take care, everybody, and we hope to see you again soon. Good night.